Peter Sterios. I live in San Luis Obispo, California. I grew up in Fresno, California, which is an agricultural town in the center of California, to a family of first-generation immigrants. My father's father was a Greek immigrant, and my mother's parents were German immigrants. And we had a pretty rough go growing up. My dad sold insurance door to door, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And I can remember my grandparents, because they owned a restaurant, bringing groceries on Sunday night for dinner, because just to help us financially. And so I grew up in a very frugal family that I learned early on the value of working and working for a living, and that everything was a blessing. Everything that you received was a blessing. And I look back on that as a very instrumental part of my makeup, that background coming from that family was helpful for now as an adult. So growing up as a kid, pretty American, experience, athletic. We took family vacations. But the thing that changed me, I think, permanently, when I was 14 years old, my father organized an overseas exchange with a Mexican family, a family in Torreon, Mexico. And as it turned out, this family was a political family. The great-great-grandfather was assassinated. He was president of Mexico, assassinated by Pancho Villa. And for a little, kid growing up in Fresno, California, to be thrown into this very politically and they were a well-known family in Mexico, and to have that experience at that age and to see the things that even at 14 I'd been indoctrinated by American culture, to now be in a foreign culture where things weren't that way, was a real eye-opener for me. That I started to see beyond my, if you call it, enculturation of growing up in America. And from 14 on, I always had an eye on travel. I always had an eye on getting out of the environment that I had grown to be comfortable in, to just stretch me a little bit intellectually and artistically. And so I went to college. I left my hometown to go away to college. And while in college, I did an overseas program in Denmark. And Denmark was also a real eye-opening experience. The Vietnam War had just ended, and Europe was, that just a lot of free-thinking people in Europe, and pretty opinionated. Americans weren't that popular back then. I guess maybe even not so much these days as well. But as an American, I got to hear a lot of stuff that wasn't easy to hear, and yet I sympathized with a lot of it. There was some honesty in the criticism of what our culture had become. And so that year in Denmark was very valuable for me in helping me understand how I see my world. And when I came back to the United States, I was definitely changed. I was changed in the way I related to my culture here, less attached, basically. I felt less of an American and more of kind of it's cliche, but citizen of the world. I didn't have a strong national identity at that point. And that's continued to this day. Even though I still live in California, live in America, I lived 8 years in New Zealand and actually became a New Zealand citizen. And I have, strong connection to that land in New Zealand and the culture with the people. I also have a strong connection to where I live in California in the Central Coast. It's one of those places in California that seems to have been overlooked in a way. There's a different quality of life there, less reliance on cars, which in California is unusual. And we walk a lot. We use our bikes to get around. In a way, it has a European quality to it, where the car is kind of just an appendage to life, not so much something that we absolutely have to have. And so living now in San Luis Obispo, from my yoga trainings, while I was in New Zealand, I met a yoga master who lived in Australia and ended up studying with him for 20 years. And that journey took me to India the first time for a year. And I went back 5 more times over 10 years to further my education in yoga. And of course, going to India is, you maybe go with an intention, but India is one of those magical places where once you get there, your intentions may or may not have relevance to why you're there. And every trip, I look back on them now and reflect, and my intentions were pretty unimportant. That the things that came to me while I was there are the things that I hold on to still now. The impressions that were made on those trips have become so much a part of me and have molded who I am. So.
Before we kind of even get more into your story, what were you even raised with spiritually?
Well, my religious upbringing was kind of a collision of 2 cultures, my father being Greek Orthodox and my mother being Protestant. And my father, I think more because of my grandparents' insistence, won the early battle to which religion to grow up in. I grew up in the Greek Orthodox religion, went to Greek school, and the context of a Greek school and maybe other cultures in America, maintain ties to the mother countries, have similar stories. But, I would have to go to regular school from, 8:30 in the morning till 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then my grandfather would pick us up right after school and take us to Greek school when all my friends were going out to play. And so there was a natural resistance to going to Greek school from day one. And yet, in hindsight, as an adult, I lost a lot of my connection to Greek culture just as I got older and less relevance. But I look back, well, maybe I could have applied myself a little better. But in the moment, it was just an obstruction to enjoying my life as a child. And that continued until I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And at that point, my grandfather was already in his 80s. And the day that religious upbringing came to a close was my grandfather was taking myself and my 2 brothers to Greek school, and he got in an automobile accident. And my older brother was hurt, not bad, but hurt enough that it gave us, along with my mother, enough, we had enough say in the matter that we were able to stop going to Greek school and ultimately stop going to Orthodox church on Sunday because it was all in Greek and we didn't understand any of it anyway, and our Greek language skills were pretty minimal. And we started going to Protestant church. And the Protestant church was a little better for us. It was all in English. The Protestant church was in our neighborhood, so a lot of the kids that were at church were friends of ours from school. And so there was more relationship at school, and we were able to do things. At church, we were able to do more things. And there wasn't school after school. It was just on Sunday, so the commitment was less on our part. And that was great until, in terms of the family, we were all in agreement that was the best place for us to get this religious training. And the minister at our church had some personal troubles, and the church closed. And that was our neighborhood church. And when the church closed, we were in our late teens, and at that point, we were adults in every sense of the word. And our parents just said, it's your choice now, if you want to continue. And none of us did. And we stopped going to church on a regular basis. And at that point, for me, if I look back on it and reflect, the spiritual part of my life in my late teens and early 20s was more through sports and the connection to spirit that I felt in team sports. And, I wouldn't have articulated it that way at the time, and more in reflection back, a lot of the needs that I felt I needed to help identify who I was for myself, I got through team sports and through excelling in sports. And I had a very, successful career as an athlete up until college. And after college, I still continued with sports, but there were other priorities like work and having a career and more travel. So when I was an exchange student in Mexico, I was 14 years old and extremely naive, I think, when it comes to the situations in life that are dangerous for a 14-year-old boy. And the memory of this event is very, all I have to do is reflect back on it, and I'm right there physically. I can feel that kind of tension that I was with a group of boys my age, that the adults had basically allowed us to go out in this wilderness area in central Mexico by ourselves. So we had no adult supervision. And there are a lot of underground caverns and rivers, underground rivers in this area where this family's cabin was. And on the day that we went into these caverns, which was, the adults had given us permission to go, but no one was really paying attention to the weather. And when we went into the cavern, and it was starting to sprinkle lightly, and unbeknownst to us, while we were in the cavern, it started to downpour. And so we found ourselves in this moving underground river, floating, basically, not on tubes, but just the current was carrying us, and the water was only chest deep. And the caverns were large, but at certain junctures, the cavern came down to just this high over your head. And because the water levels were rising, we all got into a situation where we had to go underwater. And for me, I didn't understand what was happening until it was really too late, until I was underwater, holding my breath, being carried by this current with not knowing what was on the other side of it. And, not knowing how far we were going to go before we were able to access air. And the thing happened so quickly, there was no time to really think it through, and there was no turning back because of the current. And I got to the point underground where I felt the panic of the situation starting to set in. And luckily, in that moment of panic, the cavern opened up and I was able to come up and get air, but it clearly shook my senses in that moment to the point of being emotionally disturbed for days after that, and not really, I wasn't, because of that nature of a teenage boy to bury emotions, I found that I didn't have any opportunity to really express what I'd experienced, but that moment changed me. It made me realize that life is finite. And even as a 14-year-old boy, I understood that I needed a little more relationship to myself and to my environment that was beyond just my mind. It had something to do with a deeper experience of life, a deeper appreciation for life. And I would say that experience at 14, being in a foreign culture, and then having that experience of near drowning, changed me. I I came away from that experience grateful that I was alive, and that there was a presence that, even though it appeared at the moment a dangerous situation, I felt that someone was there with me. Like someone had not saved me, but I just felt like I wasn't alone in that experience, that there was an intelligence in that situation that was greater than myself, that was protecting me, and that I wasn't in any real danger of dying, but it was just kind of looking over the edge of what I thought was my reality and seeing that there's some other reality that I am connected with. And of course, as a 14-year-old, I didn't articulate it. It was more vague. But as an adult looking back on the experience, and I've thought about it many times since, because I've had similar experiences as an adult, near-death experiences as an adult, that have also brought me back to that same place, that there is some kind of intelligence or organizing force in the world that seems to be there all the time, even in the most despairing situations. And that if you can stay present in the moment, you'll recognize that it's there. And no matter what the outcome, that presence has a certain reassurance. There's something about that presence that makes any situation it makes the situation a little more comfortable. It allows one to be in it and not be in a sense of panic. And I don't use the word comfortable as in comfortable physically. I think it's more comfortable psychologically.
What do you remember about that actual moment where you said you were underwater or in that state of
terror, panic, loss of self. Like I wasn't aware of my surroundings. In that moment of panic, I had no idea where I was. It was dark. I wasn't one of the kids that had a flashlight. The kids behind me had the flashlights. So in that moment where I was, I could have been on the moon. But I had no sense of where I was, and the panic of that. And I remember my body completely contracted, like almost like a wild animal. But it was also quick. I lost sense of time. I really, in that moment of panic, I don't know how long that lasted. It could have been a second. It could have been 10 seconds. It could have been, probably wasn't more than 20 seconds, but I remember being in that state, losing sense of self, and the next minute, I'm out. I've broken free of that narrow tunnel, and I'm into a space where my head floated above water, and that moment afterwards, it was just, all I was thinking about was breath, breathing. And the adrenaline that produced lasted for probably 4 or 5 hours afterwards. I was just feeling wired.
You said this has happened for you other times in your life. Tell me about one of those times.
Sure. When I graduated from college, I did some traveling and ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which at the time I hadn't made any commitment to a spiritual practice. At that point, I was 23, 24 years old, and still I felt different than the people that were around me, but I didn't understand exactly what that meant, other than I was different than most people that I was in community with. And as an athlete, I got involved with some athletes in Santa Fe. We actually started a rugby team. And although I didn't grow up playing rugby, I liked the the camaraderie of this particular team, and I found myself drawn to these guys. And half of the guys on this team were all instructors for a company called Outward Bound, which is a company that takes people into the wilderness. And there's definitely a spiritual aspect of those trips that people go into the wilderness. And these guys were all instructors for this company, and were, really talented outdoorsmen. And you could, literally drop them in the wild and they would survive. And they had planned this trip kayaking down the Rio Grande River from Taos down through what's called the Box and into this area downstream. And they taught a course at a local high school, which I was interested in. I wanted to learn how to kayak. And of course, in a high school course in a swimming pool, kayaking is easy. The water's clear, there's no current, and I was good in class. And good enough where they said, hey, we've got this trip in the end of February, beginning of March, which, it's still wintertime in northern New Mexico at that time. Why don't you come? And I said, do you think I'm ready? And of course you're ready, blah, blah, blah. So the day that we went, it was overcast and cold. And we had wetsuits on. And on top of the wetsuits, we had, because the wetsuits had short sleeves and short legs, we had like Patagonia pants and Patagonia pullover tops. So we were like kind of bulky guys squeezing into these kayaks, which again, at the time I didn't know any different. It's all an experience. And where we put into the river, it was, I'll never forget, the water downstream was huge. And I'm thinking, wow, I don't know if I'm really ready for this, but these guys seem to think I'm ready. So we're going to go for an experience. We get in our boats, we put into this still eddy, the water's very still, and we slide out, and they said, come on, let's go upstream where the water's calm, we'll practice a little bit. And my first experience in a moving river, my first stroke, I had so much adrenaline running again, my first stroke took me right out into the current. And instead of turning upstream, this current was strong enough, it just took me downstream. And downstream, there was about 20 feet before this little 4-foot waterfall, little drop. And I saw the waterfall coming, and I thought, I can do this. I'll just turn this boat around. And of course, the first stroke to turn the boat around, I roll the boat, and I flip, and I'm upside down. And, I went through all the things mentally of what to do. And again, without anticipating the amount of adrenaline, the first stroke to come up, I overshot. I went all the way over to the other side and flipped. And as I flipped over to the other side, the paddle hit a rock, and there goes my paddle. And so now I'm upside down in a kayak with no paddle. And there's procedure to exit the kayak, but again, unbeknownst to me at the time, when I flipped, the spray skirt that keeps the water out of the boat had pulled back, and so the boat was filling up with water now. And the pants that I had on took water on and swelled, and so when I pushed to eject, nothing. I'm jammed in this boat, and then I'm thinking about breath, and right at that moment where I'm starting to get concerned about breathing, I hit the breach of the waterfall, and that's probably what saved my life. These moss-covered rocks, I was able to dig my fingernails into them just long enough to lift my head out of the water. And as I took that breath of air, I was thinking that I would be able to hold myself on the rocks until someone, saw me. I was in trouble. But the current was too strong, and it took me. And now I'm in probably class 3 rapids, upside down in this boat. The boat is riding low in the water because it's filling with water. I can't eject, and my head, I had a helmet on, but my head's getting knocked on the bottom. And at that point, I panicked once again. And I don't understand why, but I just reached up above the boat, I'm underwater now, and just started slapping the top of the boat inverted, the boat's inverted, with my hands. And unbeknownst to me, one of the instructors had seen what was happening, had paddled down. And now this is in, class 3 rapid, boats moving. This instructor was able to position the nose of his kayak under one of my slapping hands enough that I could grab the tip of the boat, his boat, and miraculously, without flipping him, was able to hang on to that boat, because my strength at that point must have been incredible, and basically was able to get my head out of water until he was able to paddle us into calm water and then help me out of the boat. Now, again, in those kinds of situations, that moment of panic slapping the boat was just like that moment in the tunnel, in the cave. Completely out-of-body experience in a way, not really connected with a body at all, just filled with emotion. And what happened that day was there were so many events that happened that day in the exact sequence that it happened to produce those effects that were totally unconscious. And yet, in hindsight, what it produced was a profound spiritual experience for me. And that event, more than ever, I look back on it, I never saw that instructor after that. That day, you know, no one really acknowledged what had just happened. No one really spoke about that was very close to a death. And there are numerous stories on that section of river of kayakers dying. You know, that's not unusual for bodies to be pulled out of that river. And it was only years after the fact that I recognized the extent of what had happened and what that particular instructor had done to save my life, and to the point where I tried to locate him. Like I knew friends of friends, and I tried to find him, and I don't know what happened to him. I never was able to find him, to thank him again for just his effort that day that was also superhuman. Like his skill as a kayaker to be able to precisely put the tip of his boat under a moving, wild hand. I don't even understand how that could have happened. And, you know, in reflection, looking back on that experience, undeniably, it was, I don't use this language about guardian angels, but to me that day, I had what I relate to as a guardian angel. There was some force, being, intelligence, whatever, that was right there the whole way. And, you know, when I talk about faith now, I relate to it in a way that I'm clear with myself that presence in our lives is there all the time. It's there all the time. And I see it more when I'm still, you know, when I still slow my life down, when I remove the activity. And for instance, being here in Nicaragua, I feel that presence really strongly here. It's the land here and the culture here supports the relationship of faith that I have. And since arriving yesterday, I've felt it really strongly. And the situation of being here in this moment for me is also a reflection of this faith in my life. This trip had all these last minute changes. We weren't even supposed to be in this particular place. And yet this particular place is exactly where I need to be right now. It's producing something in me that helps me remember. And my life has been really busy. I just had a child, and having a child, busy, you kind of forget that there's anything but busy when you have a newborn. So, yeah, I'm feeling renewed. And my situation was dealing with a medical condition. This health opportunity, as I like to refer it to, where my diagnosis was of cancer, although it turned out to be a misdiagnosis. And through my path up to that point, I felt like this was something that I could create my own healing, that I didn't need to follow a traditional medical protocol to address this. And this particular cancer was in a part of the body where the biopsy required a surgery that I was not willing at that point to do. And I spent 2 to 3 years going through different natural healing modalities to try and affect the symptoms that I was experiencing. And I had, it was one of those journeys where I had some successes and I had some disappointments, and it was kind of an up and down journey for 3 years. And my personal life, things started to fall apart. My marriage, a business, my whole community of people in the divorce just kind of fell away, and I found myself almost orphaned in a way from all the relationships that I had built over 10 years. And at that point, I felt, I had reached the end of that journey, and something drastic needed to happen. And I decided to go to India, which is a familiar place for me, and I had been many times before that, and the decision was to go to an Ayurvedic healing center, hospital, and commit myself to a cleansing program, which they call Panchakarma. And the doctors that I had been emailing said, we have a 10-week program, and 10 weeks seemed like a lot for me, and there was resistance of, wow, 10 weeks, that's a long time. And but in the end, I just surrendered to the whole thing and just said, okay, I'm coming. So I went to India and got started in the hospital. And the first week I was there, things went well. The doctors were lovely, and it was a perfect, very austere place, rustic in a way. It's not a hospital that you would think about in the West. The room was concrete floor, concrete block walls, a single bed, a light bulb in the center of the ceiling, no glass in the windows, it's screens. And the program was no physical exercise, a very minimalist diet, very simple diet, and meditation, and a program of herbs and oil massage. And that first week was perfect. I felt at home. Second week, though, I got sick. And, India has a way sometimes of just bringing things to deal with. And all of a sudden, I'm, purging through the mouth, through the anus, just everything is a mess. And I'm dehydrated. I can feel my body kind of withering away. And the third week, that pacified. The fourth week, I'm kind of in a steady state. The fifth week I'm there, it deteriorates, and the elimination of any form of elimination in the body shut down for me. Urine shut down, feces shut down. And the one night that it shut down completely, I was in an incredible amount of discomfort. And on both a psychological level and a physical level, I was ready to die. And at 2:00 in the morning, I remember, because I wasn't sleeping, I'm laying there in this room in India, a long way from anywhere, from things familiar to me, watching this row of lice walking up the wall, up to the ceiling, and thinking, this is it, this is my moment of truth. And there was no one to call. There's no phone. There was a night man, but he wasn't a doctor. I mean, I'm sure I could have arranged for a doctor, but at that point I had come to the decision that I'm ready to die, to take whatever comes. And I took off all my clothes and I laid naked on the concrete in the center of the room. And I just remember saying, take me. Just, I'm ready. Come down. I didn't use the word come down. I just said, take me wherever it is that I need to go now. Take me. And I hadn't slept for 2 nights. And I don't remember what happened after that. But I woke up the next morning on the concrete floor, right where I'd been, and something had shifted. Physically, something shifted, which was incredible, and psychologically, something shifted where that presence that I've been talking about came in again that morning. And the reaching out to that God presence in the middle of the night, the event in the next morning, it was undeniable for me that I had established some relationship, which is a departure from the past. That the past was, I didn't initiate anything. And in this situation, the initiation was just surrender. Like, I'm done efforting. I'm done trying to mentally fix myself or heal myself. I'm just turning it over. And what came in that moment, I relate to it now as grace. The grace of this presence in our lives, this, if you are comfortable with the word God, this God presence in our lives that comes for us and supports our time here. And that was undeniable in that moment. And from that point forward, I came back from India after that time. And right before I left India, I had another little experience with a teacher there, a yoga teacher who didn't speak a word of English, but we, in 5 days that we hung out together, it was like I'd opened myself up and I'd gotten through that dark night of the soul. And then this teacher showed up a week later and just gave me all this understanding that I lacked before I went through that experience. And the combination of those two, having that experience authentic and exposed and raw and completely in state of surrender, and then having someone show up within a week to help me understand how to move from that point forward, was a miracle. I mean, I relate it as a miracle. And miracles are nice things to have in life. I came across a quote, I don't even know who the author was, but this was 5 or 6 years ago, that miracles are life unimpeded. And that is like a mantra that I repeat to myself all the time. That when we're in a place of surrender, like acceptance and surrender, that miracles show up in a way that it's hard to effort a miracle. You know, it's hard to create miracles. They just have a way of showing up in that moment of surrender, in that moment of grace. And that's pretty much one of the most defining moments of my adult life. And I reflect on that. What it does is it brings me to a state of gratitude for every moment of my life. You know, every moment that I'm able to take a breath, there's gratitude. And I find gratitude is one of the most powerful healing energies on the planet. And I've used my experiences to reconnect myself to the state of gratitude as often as possible.
Tell me about your yoga journey.
My yoga journey was, I mean, always in hindsight, when you look at my upbringing in middle-class America in the 60s, yoga wasn't even on my radar. As you know, I was in my early teens, not old enough to really understand what the 60s were all about. And all throughout the 70s was mostly involved in sports and not really involved in any kind of social issues or even spiritual journeys. So for me to like embrace yoga was obviously a shock to my parents. They didn't really understand what my interest could be in something that they didn't understand. And actually, this is kind of a funny story. My first trip to India, I departed from my hometown. I moved back home just to park all my personal belongings before I went. And my parents took me to the airport, and my parents have said goodbye to me on journeys because I traveled a lot, and they've never been that emotional. But this time my mom was crying, and I could tell my dad was upset, and what's wrong? And she goes, "You're gonna die. You're going to that place and people die there." And I said, "Mom, I'm not gonna die, I'll be back. I'll be back in time for Christmas, And so the journey really got its start by accident. I attended my first yoga class at university in California. And it wasn't more than just looking at a schedule and looking at physical activity that I hadn't done that looked interesting. And yoga was there. And I said, I'm going to try that. And I went, and as an athlete, I had a certain pride at that time where, I was the only man in the room. It was all women, and mostly elderly women. And I was challenged physically. It was hard. And the flexibility stuff, I hated. It was just painful. And I remember leaving that first class going, well, this is going to be a long quarter. I'm not looking forward to it. And yet each time before the class, there was a certain challenge to it that there was something inside me that was stimulated, like, wow, this is challenging, both mentally and physically. This is good. And so I did that class at my last year in college, but then graduated and kind of forgot about yoga for a few years until I moved to Santa Fe. And when I moved to Santa Fe, because that community is more spiritually inclined, yoga was more visible. And I started going to a yoga class in Santa Fe, but I didn't really find a teacher that I felt in relationship with. And so I wasn't that serious about yoga while I was living in Santa Fe. And then the rugby team that I was playing on, that I mentioned before, organized a tour to New Zealand. And, again, how the circumstances of life kind of take you. When the day came for the team to go, everyone backed out except me and one other guy. And I'd already bought my ticket, and I was going to New Zealand. I didn't care. And so I went to New Zealand with this other rugby player, and we stayed there for about 6 months. And he came back after 6 months. And while I was there, I met some people, and I wanted to stay. And they offered me a job. So I started working in New Zealand, and that job led to another job and led to another job. And that other job moved me to down south into Wellington at the southern tip of the North Island. And it's there that I met my yoga teacher, 20 years, who had come from Australia to teach a workshop in Wellington. And after that first weekend workshop, and this is, I say this lovingly about my teacher, he created such an altered state for me mentally. Like his practice was so revolutionary for me in being able to separate my, let's call it waking consciousness, with another layer of consciousness. And so much so that I, after the weekend on a Sunday night, got in my car at the end of the workshop, drove down this mountain, this hill where Victoria University was in Wellington. And on the first intersection, the first stoplight, turned on a green light, but turned right in front of an oncoming car that I never saw. And we hit head on and totally totaled my car and did a lot of damage to the other car. And I hit the windshield and gashed my head, and I've got like 26 stitches in my scalp from that event. And that scar that's up there is just a little souvenir from my first, experience of what became a practice for 20 years. And of course, that in that moment, I look back at it now, it was a little bit dangerous situation. It was a serious automobile accident, but it was a blessing. That whole experience that weekend changed me forever. And the scar that I have is just a nice reminder, how sometimes these scars in our lives are actually tools. They're very important stopping points in our journeys to other ways of being. And that experience that weekend guided me into a 20-year relationship with my teacher. And in year 20, he basically so I started organizing his tours into the United States. He came and, it was right when my first marriage was failing. And he said, "My time with you is over." And that wasn't what I was expecting to hear, because I was kind of going through a hard time. I was like, "What do you mean you're leaving now? I'm kind of going through it. It'd be nice if you kind of help me." And he said, "I've given you everything that I can give you, and to stay now would be a disservice to you. So now it's time to step out on your own." And I struggled for 2 or 3 years after that, just not wanting to teach yoga, because at that point I'd been teaching for 10 years, not wanting to teach, not really even wanting to practice. So psychologically, I just felt numb. And after 2 or 3 years, it started to come back. My understanding of what I'd been through started to help me back into a place where yoga reintegrated into my life. And I had a better understanding of what the last 3 years meant and how it was a necessary evolutionary process for where I am now.
What is the name of the type of yoga that you lead, and what was his name?
His name was Shandor Remete, and that style of yoga is Hatha yoga. His practice, he studied with BKS Iyengar in India, who's one of, I guess, 3 teachers that studied with Krishnamacharya, which was a master teacher in India around the turn of the century. And basically, through his relationship with Iyengar, and he had also started yoga from his father. He was Hungarian by birth. His father was a yoga teacher. And so it was an integral part of his life. And my relationship to him was, he was the first male yoga teacher I ever had. And not only was he a male teacher, but he was a man, like a man's man. And by that, he had fought in Vietnam. He was an Australian Special Forces. He was a black belt in karate, in martial arts. There was a masculine presence in him that was unusual for a male yoga teacher. And really, I related to that aspect of him more initially. Like, that's what drew me to him initially, because I still had that connection to that masculine kind of adrenaline or testosterone fueled way of being as a man. And he seemed to integrate it. Like, he seemed to be able to have his feminine and masculine just right up on the table at the same time. And, growing up in the 70s as a man, I don't know how old you are, but as a man in the 70s, testosterone was not appreciated that much. Like, the women's movement was getting their feet under them. And, to be a nice, I was bred, growing up, if I look at all my role models in elementary school, junior high school, all women. Like, I didn't have a male teacher until I was in 11th grade in high school. So this era of the 70s where, it was a pretty clear message to me as a man that having a penis was not an asset in culture. Like the feminine was more attractive to women. And as a young, as a teenager in early 20s, and now my hormones are starting to kick in where I want a relationship, and my role model was to be kind of strong in the feminine, like to have that nurturing quality, because women would find that more attractive. And I actually struggled through relationship in those 10-year period of my 20s, because although that nurturing aspect is attractive initially, if it's too much, it gets boring. And I found in so many of my relationships just crumbling. And I'm like, why? Come on, I'm a nice guy. I'm a peacemaker. I'm gonna make this all right. And it was just, I didn't understand that I so lacked any kind of masculine principle in my life. And so here's this yoga teacher who's got it integrated. And I was like, wow, I'm attracted to this. This is like, I don't have to throw out the bathwater, so to speak. And he taught me a lot. And, he's misunderstood. He's a misunderstood guy. And a lot of people that haven't studied with him for as long as I study with him misunderstand what he's trying to teach. And they only see that macho kind of testosterone-driven side of him. And yet I don't see that. I see it in balance. And so that education helped me. And Hatha yoga, the word Hatha is really the integration of the masculine and the feminine. Hatha is solar and lunar principles integrated. So he taught me a lot. And, one of the things that he told me when we separated was, I don't want you to teach anything I taught you. I don't want you to teach my sequences. I don't want you to teach the poses the way I teach them. And initially, I didn't understand that. What do you mean? I can't teach what you taught me. What am I supposed to teach? And yet, in hindsight, I know exactly what he was looking for. What he was challenging me to look for is an authentic expression of my own practice. And that 2 to 3 year period where I struggled because, I'd spent 20 years going through a discipline, through a routine, and then to just have that kind of stripped away and say, go find something for yourself. I didn't know where to look. And what was, miraculous, if you want to call it that, was my physical body started to break down. The injuries that I had accumulated along a career of athletic pursuit, separated shoulder, torn ligaments, and all these kind of injuries the symptoms started coming back. And it's like, wow, I need to do something here. So I started to, develop this practice to address my body, symptoms. And that evolved into a style of practice that's unique. I can't say that it's original. It's what I've taken it from different sources, but I've put it together into a unique way that helped me address physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of myself. And now as a teacher, I'm sharing those personal experiences through my classes, through my teaching. And a lot of the people that are coming to my classes are people that have injuries or people that have some health situation going on in their lives. And the vigorous kind of yoga that's popular in the West hasn't served them that well. And they're looking for, they want something physical in their lives, but they're not ready to just dive into a power yoga class, for instance. They need some kind of transitional space. And I feel like my classes is that transitional space. It helps people with pre-existing situations to begin moving their bodies again, and then offer opportunities as they get more confidence to challenge their bodies a little bit, challenge their minds a lot. And, if anything, what my life has shown me is that evolution happens through stress. like even a species evolves because some environmental stressor comes in and forces the change. And I view yoga practice that way, that yoga introduces a stressor. And basically, if our bodies were as functional as we came into this world as infants, if we had the flexibility and mobility that what we had as an infant, and I'm seeing this now with my daughter, her body, there's not an ounce of resistance in it. But as adults, we've made these choices, lifestyle choices that basically cause resistance, contraction in our body. So we're starting to lose this birthright of a strong, flexible body through sedentary lifestyles, etc. And to evolve back towards, what we entered this world, yoga is that beneficial stressor that comes in and basically creates opportunities to meet resistance in our bodies. And what we do when we meet resistance is the key. If we have judgment about what we're meeting, like I had surgery, I'm never going to be able to do that. Or my dad had that and I've just got a life, I'm going to have a lower back problem. My dad had a lower back problem. These kinds of psychological stories that we tell ourselves. And what I've experienced in my own 35 years of doing yoga is there's almost every story that I have carried in my life, I can let go of. I've had a lot of injuries, and if I just believed what my doctors told me when I had those injuries, I tore the meniscus in this left knee, and the orthopedic guy says, you're going to have surgery otherwise, and I did this when I was in my 20s. When you're in your 50s, you're going to, lose that knee. You're going to have knee replacement. Well, I'm 54, and the knee's fine. I mean, occasionally it gives me a little wake-up call, and I have to pay attention to it, but I have the tools to address it. So the way I teach, I introduce people to the idea of changing their relationship to pain in the body. And pain is the body's language, the language that the body uses to communicate imbalance. And the imbalance can be, lack of use, overuse, or inheritance, like you've inherited something. And so Hatha Yoga is a tool to learn this language of pain and do it in a controlled way so you decide how much pain you're going to feel in one day. And of course, if I marketed my yoga retreats, come to Nicaragua for a week and live with your pain, I wouldn't get that many people to come. So I've come up with the term gravity and grace. And gravity is this force that's external to our bodies that is really the only energy that's required externally for you to enter into a yoga pose. And grace is more of an internal force. And the internal force of grace comes in the moment of surrender. So, my life has just reaffirmed that for me. People think of gravity as something that's real, and yet in the early days, before gravity was scientifically proven, gravity wasn't so real. People didn't understand it. And grace, in a lot of ways, is similar. Like, grace for me is as real as gravity. And yet, you're not going to find any scientists proving that grace is real. And yet, I have an experience of grace numerous times in my life that I know in that moment of surrender, the faith that has been instilled in my life, grace enters. And it's a real experience for me. Well, those years when I was sick, those 3 years, I went to seminars, I did so much stuff trying to create peace in my life. And I failed. And it made me question, is this all just a product of my imagination? And it was almost like what I identified with my mind. I grew up in a family that put a lot of emphasis on logic. And if I couldn't use my mind to solve a problem, there was something, wrong. And so during those 2 to 3 years, where everything that I could think of to heal myself wasn't working, I didn't understand it at the time, but I questioned, why am I doing this a lot? And I think, in my experience, that period of my illness, my divorce, my, family life and community disintegrating, you feel lonely and depressed and abandoned. And it's really hard to have faith in those times. And to be honest, I gave up. I failed. I kind of abandoned that 2 to 3 year period. I was pessimistic. I was depressed a lot. I avoided going on antidepressants. I just accepted the fact that I was depressed a lot. And that experience in India, I came away from it. And I teach this, that enlightenment and despair are very similar states of mind. And the difference is attitude. Enlightenment is this simultaneous emptiness and fullness, and the realization that there's no difference between the two. And despair is this pure emptiness without the understanding that in that emptiness there's a sense of fullness. And I have that experience in my own life journey, and I've seen that work, that change in the way you relate to depression and despair work for people that were clinically depressed, that were on medication. And it's not an overnight journey. It's when you're, working with depression, it takes your own unique process. And it's not that I'm saying throw your meds away if you're in that kind of a situation, but there's a point with which you can start to cut back and eventually let go of completely your need for external support when the mind comes in line with your, true experience of what you're feeling. And I know it's a tough sell about enlightenment, but when I look at the people in my life that I have read about or experienced as enlightened beings, none of them got there by doing a bliss workshop in Nicaragua. They all got there by going through some dark event in their lives. And I just feel like enlightenment is really that realization that sometimes the despair and darkness in our lives is a gift. It's coming to shift our awareness, our attention away from where we've been enculturated to a broader viewpoint. And in my experience, depression is an extremely powerful tool to do that. It cuts away all illusion very quickly, illusion of ego. The reason I'm resisting is the most, if you ask me what I'm grateful for, we'd be talking for another 20 minutes. And to say what I'm most grateful for challenges me, because I'm grateful for the relationship that I'm in now with my wife. I'm grateful for my daughter, who's shown up late in my life, who's brought an experience that I would have never seen myself having. And frankly, as a spiritual teacher, I knew nothing until I had my daughter. She, on so many levels, challenges me to, really be authentic with what, talk walk the talk, so to speak, because she knows how to push buttons even at 3 years old. But I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for all the so-called negative events in my life. I'm grateful for my ex-wife having the courage to divorce me. That whatever decision process she went through to make that decision took courage, and I'm in hindsight incredibly grateful, because she took me through an experience that I wouldn't have chosen for myself. I would have stuck it out, and yet it created freedom in her life and freedom in mine now. So there's sincere gratitude for that. I'm gratitude for my health. I ended up having surgery 2 years ago to find out what was going on inside my body, and they removed a tumor that was huge but non-cancerous. And so that has given me an incredible appreciation. There's nothing like a negative biopsy, like if you're working with cancer and then to actually confirm that it's not, that day changes, when you've had that experience. And I've heard the same thing from people that have healed themselves from cancer, that have gone through whatever protocols they went through to kick the disease, that it changes the experience you have on a daily basis. You're grateful for every day of your life. Every day the sun comes up, or every day that you wake up out of bed, there's gratitude. And that's a more regular practice for me than yoga. I wake up every day, the first time I am conscious, in gratitude for another day. And I know
some prayer ritual that you use, or when you wake up, or just a sense of
no,
gratitude?
it's just being in the moment, paying attention to my breath. This is the process I go through. Recognizing that I'm moving from a sleeping consciousness into a waking consciousness, and I'm kind of in that in-between place. Starting to pay attention to the quality of my breathing, not just breathing, but actually feeling the breath, and even if I use a visualization, the exchange that the breath has with the inner workings of my body. And then going more conscious into the waking state of, I have this amazing being next to me and my wife. And I live in a place that in San Luis Obispo that's connected to nature. The mountains are nearby. We live on a river, and we have a river going through our backyard, and the presence of that water in my life, and there's a gratitude of that connection to nature. And like here, it's undeniable when you're in nature, the quality, the effect that it has on the quality of your mental state. So I live that where I live. And I sometimes forget it, with the busyness of my life, and it takes coming to a place like this to remember, oh yeah, this is the life that I have. So there's a gratitude for my life's path, my soul's path, so to speak, to be where I am today. My greatest wish is for peace, really. Peace, not external peace so much as peace in the souls of people. Like, in talking with some of the local people here, I can feel peace here, peace in these people's experience. And, people say that Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the world, maybe on a material level, but I wouldn't say that on a spiritual level. Like, you can feel these people's soul here. And there are special places like that around the world. I just don't see it that much in Western culture. And, the wish for me would be that people in the West feel peace in their souls, find an experience that brings peace to their souls. I have a message, but it changes. When I look at what I, as an individual, have to offer, I don't have much to offer. Like, I see myself as an individual without much to offer. But as a soul, on a soul level, which I recognize in everyone, the presence that my soul brings to other people's souls is something that I feel like I want to share. And I don't travel to make money. You know, my teaching on a material level, it doesn't provide much for my family or for myself. But I find for whatever blessing that has come into my life that I get invited to go teach yoga somewhere, I feel like this is my gift, that I'm able to share this message where I can give you information that makes your mind comfortable, but I'd rather not give you a lot of information. I'd rather give you more of an experience of my presence. And yoga is a fantastic thing for that, because yoga in general is a silent practice. And I come as a space holder. And the way I teach is I get up in the center or the front of the room. And as I'm teaching, I'm actually doing the practice with my students. And some days it's a silent practice and I just do the practice and my students follow me. And those are my favorite days, actually, because it's not an intellectual day. It forces the student to rely just on the sound of their breath and their experience on their yoga mat. He's a lighthearted man. That, for me, is... I haven't always been lighthearted, but I find that at this point in my life, when I'm lighthearted, I have more to share. And if, you know, circumstances in life bring heaviness, that I'm of less service to people. So I like being playful, and you know, I enjoy the 3-year-old in me relating to my daughter. And you know, if I were to look at gifts in my life, being able to find that 3-year-old inside myself again with my daughter is an amazing gift. So
Thank you so much for doing this.